Most of what the world believes about Mexico can be carried in a single piece of hand luggage. White beaches and turquoise water, a resort with a swim-up bar, a headline about the cartels, a plate of tacos, a bottle of tequila, a song played a little too loudly beside the pool. None of it is wrong. The beaches are real. So is the violence, and the music, and the food. For most visitors, that is Mexico, a place you fly into for a week and fly out of with a tan and a few photographs. But there is another country underneath that one, literally underneath it, beneath the streets of its capital, one of the largest cities on Earth, home to more than 20 million people, lies the buried body of an empire. Stone temples, drowned canals, the foundations of palaces, all packed beneath the asphalt like pages pressed flat in a closed book. And beneath that empire lies a lake. 600 years ago, where the traffic now sits 8 lanes deep, there was open water. A city floated on it, a city of 250,000 people, larger than any in Spain, reached only by causeways and canoes. When the first Europeans saw it, some of them wondered aloud whether they were dreaming. They were not dreaming. They were looking at Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Mexica, the people we now call the Aztecs. And within 2 years, they would take it apart, stone by stone, and build their own capital directly on top of it. That is the part most travelers never learn. Mexico City is not a city that replaced an older one nearby. It is a city built on the exact same ground, one civilization stacked on the body of the last, the way new rings grow over the scar in a tree. And it did not happen only once. On this one patch of earth, 3 empires have risen and fallen. An Aztec empire raised from a lake, a Spanish empire built from its rubble. And, for 3 strange years in the 19th century, a European empire ruled by an Austrian prince who was crowned in a cathedral made from the stones of the first. 3 empires, 1 soil, each convinced it would be the last. So the real question is not what Mexico is. The question is, how many Mexicos there are, stacked one beneath the other, and what it means that the city sitting on top of them all is, right now, slowly sinking back down toward the water where the whole story began. To understand why so many empires chose this single valley, you have to start before the Aztecs, with an empire even they could not explain. 40 kilometers northeast of the modern city stand 2 of the largest pyramids ever built in the Americas. The taller of them rises more than 60 meters, its base nearly as wide as the Great Pyramid of Giza. Around it spreads the grid of a planned city. Broad avenues, apartment compounds, drainage, workshops that once held more than 100,000 people. At its height, around the year 500, it was one of the largest cities anywhere on the planet. Down its central axis runs a great processional road, more than 2 kilometers long, lined with platforms and temples that the people who came later would call the Avenue of the Dead. And we do not know what its builders called it. We do not know what language they spoke, who their kings were, or why, sometime in the 7th century, they set fire to the heart of their own city and walked away from it. Beneath one of its pyramids, the Temple of the Feathered Serpent, archaeologists have found the remains of more than 200 people, their hands bound behind them, buried as offerings on the day it was raised. Whoever these builders were, they understood power and ritual, and the price of both. The Aztecs did not build this place. They found it, already ancient, already abandoned, already a ruin, 7 centuries after it fell. They walked its dead avenues and decided that this could only be the place where the world itself had been made. They named it Teotihuacan, the place where the gods were created. They made pilgrimages here. They carried its broken stone masks home as treasures and modeled their own kingship on a memory of it. This is the first thing to understand about the ground we are standing on. Even the empire we think of as ancient was itself walking through someone else's ruins, telling itself a story about who had come before. The layering had already begun, long before the first Mexica ever arrived. 500 kilometers to the south, in a valley ringed by dry mountains, sits a flattened hilltop called Monte Alban. The Zapotec people leveled an entire mountain summit by hand more than 2,000 years ago and built a city of plazas and observatories and tombs above the valley floor. People have lived in the valley below it without a single break for longer than almost anywhere else in the Americas, somewhere on the order of 10,000 years. Here is the contradiction at the center of Mexico. The country the world imagines as young, a holiday discovered in the last few decades, sits on some of the most continuously inhabited ground on Earth. The cultures here did not vanish into museum cases. They kept speaking. Today, more than 1.5 million people still speak Zapotec, or a closely related language. The markets of Oaxaca still sell the same chilies, the same chocolate, the same corn that fed Monte Alban when Rome was still a village. And it was from a tiny mountain village in this region, in 1806, that a Zapotec boy named Benito Juarez was born. In a place so small and so remote, it had no road. He was orphaned young. He herded sheep. He spoke no Spanish until he was 12 years old. Remember him? 60 years from now, this shepherd's son will stand at the center of the Third Empire's final hour and decide whether a European emperor lives or dies. But the heart of the whole story is the valley in the middle, the high basin, more than 2,000 meters above the sea, ringed by volcanoes, where 5 shallow lakes once met and mingled. The year is 1325. A wandering tribe, poor and unwelcome, looked down on by the older cities around the lake, is searching for somewhere it is allowed to settle. Their priests have told them to watch for a sign, an eagle perched on a cactus growing straight out of bare rock, a serpent held in its beak. On a low, swampy island in the salt lake of Texcoco, they see it. It is close to the worst possible place to build a city. The island is small, marshy, surrounded by water too brackish to drink. So they make the land they need. They weave great rafts of reeds, pile them high with mud dredged from the lake bed, anchor them with the roots of willow trees, and plant them, floating gardens called chinampas, so fertile they can yield as many as 7 harvests in a year. They drive stone causeways out across the open water. They build an aqueduct to carry fresh spring water in from the hills. Island by island, raft by raft, the city grows out of the lake. Within 2 centuries, the despised tribe rules an empire. Tenochtitlan and 2 neighboring cities bind themselves into an alliance that collects tribute from more than 5 million people. The capital alone holds perhaps 200,000, larger than Rome, larger than any city in Spain. Its market, in the sister city of Tlatelolco, draws 60,000 traders on a single day, selling gold, jade, cacao, feathers, and slaves under one roof. The streets are swept clean. There are aqueducts, public latrines, a botanical garden, even a zoo. At the center rises the Templo Mayor, a twin temple pyramid expanded 7 separate times, each ruler raising a larger shell over the last, exactly as the city itself is built, layer over layer. And on a wooded hill at the lake's edge, the emperors keep a private retreat for themselves, a place called Chapultepec, the Hill of the Grasshoppers. Hold on to that hill, it is going to outlive 3 separate empires. Their hold on the world never felt secure. The Mexica believed the sun itself had to be fed to keep rising, and that the universe had already been destroyed and remade 4 times before. Once every 52 years, when their 2 calendars came back into alignment, they let every fire in the basin go out, every hearth, every temple flame, and waited in the dark to see whether the sun would return at all. On a hilltop above the lake, a priest kindled 1 new flame, and from that single fire, the light was carried back to every home in the valley. An entire civilization betting its survival on 1 spark every 52 years. And the cost of that fear has to be told plainly. At the dedication of the Great Temple, the Mexica sacrificed captives on its steps in numbers the chroniclers counted in the thousands, and racked the skulls in long rows in the plaza below. The same people who built clean streets and floating gardens also fed their gods on human blood. Both things are true, and both belong in the record. And the eagle on the cactus, the sign that told a wandering people where to stop, they carve it, paint it, weave it into everything they make. It is the emblem of who they are. You will see it again. In fact, you are looking at it right now. It is on the flag of modern Mexico. Step back from the valley, and the sheer scale of the country comes into view. Mexico stretches almost 2,000 miles, from the deserts that bleed across the United States border in the north to the rainforests that touch Guatemala in the south. It has 2 long coastlines, the Pacific on one side, the Gulf and the Caribbean on the other, and a spine of mountains down the middle, the 2 Sierra Madre ranges that wall the high central plateau off from both seas. This is the place where 2 living worlds collide. To the north, the animals and plants of temperate North America. To the south, the tropical life of Central and South America. They overlap in Mexico the way they do almost nowhere else, which is why a country covering barely 1% of the planet's land surface holds something close to 1 in every 10 of its known species. Deserts studded with giant cactus in the north, cloud forests dripping in the highland fog, coral reefs, mangroves, pine ridges, and salt flats in the deep south. One country holding 2 of nearly everything. Above it all flies a bird that ties the whole story together. The golden eagle, the same eagle the Mexica saw on the cactus, the same eagle stamped on the modern flag and minted into the coins. It is one of the largest birds of prey in North America, with a wingspan that can pass 2 meters, riding the mountain thermals on wings held in a shallow V. To the people who founded Tenochtitlan, it was not the symbol of a nation that did not yet exist. It was a direct instruction from a god. 700 years later, it is still the first thing printed on the passport. In the southern jungles moves a heavier presence. The jaguar, the largest cat in the Americas, broad-skulled, powerful enough to kill with a single bite through the bone of the head rather than the throat. To the Maya and the Mexica alike, it was the animal of kings and of the night, of caves and the underworld. It is endangered now, its forest cut into islands, but it has not left. In the dense green of Chiapas and the Yucatan, the jaguar still walks ground where its image was carved into temple walls 1,000 years ago. And every winter, the highlands receive a different kind of visitor, one that arrives in the hundreds of millions. The monarch butterfly. Each autumn, the monarchs of eastern North America fly south as far as 3,000 miles to a few small patches of fir forest in the mountains west of Mexico City. They gather so thickly that whole branches bend under their weight and the trees turn orange and seem to breathe. No single butterfly makes the round trip. The ones that arrive have never been here before. They are the great-grandchildren of the ones that left. Somewhere inside a body that weighs less than a paperclip is a map none of them were ever taught, and a single, long-lived generation, born just once a year, that lives 8 or 9 months instead of a few short weeks, for one purpose only: to carry the species back to the exact same trees its ancestors left behind. They have been doing it since long before there was any border to cross. And in the cloud forests of the south lives the bird the old empires prized above every other, the resplendent quetzal, trailing nearly a meter of iridescent green tail behind it as it flies. Its feathers were worth more than gold to the Maya and the Mexica, reserved for kings and for the gods themselves. The feathered serpent deity, Quetzalcoatl, carries its name. The Emperor Moctezuma owned a headdress of more than 400 quetzal feathers. That very headdress survives today, not in Mexico, but in a glass case in a museum in Vienna, the old Habsburg capital. Hold on to that detail. The Habsburgs are not finished with this story. The variety does not stop at the eagle and the cat and the butterfly. In the far northwest, a long, thin finger of land called Baja California reaches down between the Pacific and a narrow sea so rich that the explorer Jacques Cousteau called it the world's aquarium. Every winter, gray whales swim the entire length of the Pacific coast to give birth in its warm lagoons, where the calves are gentle enough to come up to the boats. And in the same waters lives the rarest marine mammal on the planet, the vaquita, a small porpoise found nowhere else, of which only a handful now remain, drowned in fishing nets faster than they can breed. In the northern deserts and the deep gorges of Copper Canyon, a canyon system larger and deeper than the Grand Canyon, the Raramuri people run distances of 100 miles and more across the rock, on foot, as they have for centuries. The same country that holds the monarch holds the whale, the wolf, and the long-distance runner, two of everything. Most people who come to Mexico for the ancient world come to the Yucatan, to the great stepped pyramid of Chichen Itza, where on the equinox, the late sun throws a shadow down the staircase that ripples like a serpent sliding to the ground. They take the photograph, they listen to the guide, they leave with the feeling that they have seen the old Mexico and that it is safely over. And they have seen something real. The Maya were astronomers and mathematicians who tracked the planet Venus across centuries and built a written language entirely their own. But the version sold on the day tour is a story about an ending, a mysterious people who raised marvels and then disappeared. They did not disappear. There are roughly 6 million Maya alive today, speaking some 30 different Mayan languages, farming the same thin limestone country their ancestors farmed. The peninsula has almost no rivers. The rains sink straight down through the porous rock into a vast, hidden network of flooded caves and sinkholes called cenotes. The Maya saw these pools as doorways into the underworld and lowered offerings into their depths. So here is the quiet correction. The pyramid you photograph is not a tombstone. It is the silent part of a culture that never actually died. The loud, living version of that same culture is standing right next to you, selling cold water in the shade. And it is the temple that fell quiet, not the people. And the valley itself has never stopped being watched. From the high basin around Mexico City, on a clear morning, you can see two snow-capped volcanoes standing together on the horizon. One of them, Popocatépetl, still smokes. It is one of the most active volcanoes in North America, and it has buried villages within living memory. The other, Iztaccíhuatl, lies long and still beside it, its ridgeline shaped like a sleeping woman. The Aztecs told a story about the two of them, a warrior and a princess kept apart in life, laid down side by side in the mountains forever. Geologists tell a colder story of fault lines and magma and the long violence of the Ring of Fire. Both are true. The same volcanoes that the Mexica worship from the lake are the volcanoes whose ash, washed down into the basin over millions of years, helped lay down the very lake bed that the modern city is now sinking into. The land here was never neutral ground. It was always alive and always moving. In 1519, a Spanish expedition under Hernán Cortés lands on the Gulf Coast, near what is now the port of Veracruz. It is only a few hundred men. Against an empire of millions, it should be nothing at all. But the empire is resented. The tribute that Tenochtitlan extracts has made bitter enemies of the peoples around it, and Cortés gathers them as allies, tens of thousands of them. He has something else too. A young Nahua woman the Spanish baptize as Marina, whom Mexico would remember as La Malinche. Sold into slavery as a girl, she speaks both Nahuatl and Maya, and quickly learns Spanish, and she becomes the voice through which two worlds first understand each other. She is interpreter, strategist, and the mother of one of the first children of mixed Spanish and indigenous blood, which is why, 5 centuries later, Mexicans still argue over her name. To some, she is the great traitor. To others, she is the mother of a new people. She is both. She is the hinge on which the old world turns into the new one. Cortés marches inland toward the lake. In November, the Emperor Moctezuma II receives the Spanish inside his own city, lodges them in a palace, and within days finds himself a prisoner inside it. Then the killing starts. While Cortés is away on the coast, his deputy orders an attack on unarmed Mexican nobles gathered for a religious festival in the sacred precinct, hemmed in by its own walls. Thousands are cut down in a single afternoon. The city rises in fury and drives the Spanish back out across the causeways at a terrible cost, on a night the survivors would remember as the Night of Sorrows. And then the invisible thing arrives. Smallpox, carried unknowingly from the old world, sweeps through the valley. The Mexica have no immunity to it whatsoever. It kills the warriors, the priests, the emperor's own successor, perhaps half the people in the basin, in a matter of months. It is not the sword that breaks the empire, it is the disease that walks ahead of it. It is the 13th of August, 1521. After a siege of 93 days, the causeways cut, the aqueduct broken, the city burning and starving behind its canals, the last emperor, a young man named Cuauhtémoc, is captured trying to slip away across the water by canoe. The resistance is over. Tenochtitlan, the floating city that took 200 years to raise out of a lake, has fallen. Cuauhtémoc is not killed at once. The Spanish, convinced he has hidden the city's gold somewhere in the ruins, burn the soles of his feet to make him talk. He gives them nothing. There is almost nothing left to give. Years later, on a long march through the southern jungle, they hang him from a tree anyway. The last emperor of the First Empire dies on the end of a rope, far from his drowned city. What follows is not only conquest, it is replacement. Cortés gives the order to level what is left and to build a Spanish capital on the very same spot. The Templo Mayor is torn down to its foundations, and its cut stones are dragged a few hundred meters and set into the walls of a new Catholic cathedral. Remember those stones. They are not destroyed, only buried, only moved. They will come back into this story. The Emperor's Palace becomes the ground of the Viceroy's Palace. The Sacred Plaza becomes the central square. And the lake itself is sentenced to death. Over the next 3 centuries, the Spanish drain Lake Texcoco to stop the floods that keep swallowing their new city and to make dry room for it to grow, pumping and digging and channeling the water away until the canals are streets and the floating gardens are firm ground. The water that made the city possible is being slowly engineered out of existence. Hold that thought too. The lake is going to want it back. The empire that grew here would make Spain the richest power in the world, and not only from silver, though the silver mountains of places like Guanajuato funded European wars for 200 years. One of its most valuable exports of all was an insect. On the flat green pads of the nopal cactus lives a small gray scale insect called cochineal. Crushed and dried, it yields a red so deep and so permanent that Europe had never seen anything like it. The red of cardinals' robes, of royal banners, of the British soldier's coat. For long stretches of the colonial period, this dried bug was worth more by weight than almost anything else Spain shipped home, second only to silver itself. An empire, in part, built on a creature the size of a grain of rice, farmed on a cactus in the deserts of the south. But all of that wealth was paid for in lives, on a scale that is hard to hold in the mind. In the silver mines of the north, indigenous and enslaved workers were driven underground in their thousands, and the diseases that came with the conquest kept killing long after the fighting stopped. Wave after wave of smallpox, measles, typhus, against which the people of the valley had no defense. By some estimates, the native population of Mexico fell by as much as 9 in every 10 within a century of Cortés. The empire of cathedrals and red dye and silver was raised on one of the largest collapses of human population in all of recorded history. The new city rose, quite literally, over the bodies of the people who had built the old one. The Spanish brought their god, their language, and their calendar, and they set out to bury the old beliefs as thoroughly as they had buried the temples. They did not entirely succeed. Just 10 years after the conquest, on a hill called Tepeyac at the northern edge of the city, an indigenous man named Juan Diego reports that a dark-skinned virgin has appeared to him and spoken to him in Nahuatl. The hill of Tepeyac had been, before the conquest, a place where a mother goddess of the Mexica was worshipped. On that exact spot now rises a basilica to the Virgin of Guadalupe, and she becomes the most beloved image in the country, carried 3 centuries later as the banner of Mexico's War of Independence. An indigenous saint on an indigenous holy hill in the indigenous language, wrapped in the robes of the conqueror's church. That is not the old world destroyed. That is the old world surviving, in disguise, inside the new one. And out of the collision, against every intention of the men who caused it, came an entirely new people. The Spanish built an elaborate hierarchy of blood, Spaniard above mixed, above indigenous, above enslaved African. Dozens of carefully named rungs, even painted in neat series to keep everyone in their assigned place. But blood does not obey paintings. Within a few generations, the great majority of Mexico was mestizo, neither purely indigenous nor purely European, but a fusion of both, descended on one side from the conquered and on the other from the conquerors, and often unsure which ancestor to mourn and which to claim. The country that exists today is more than almost any other on earth the child of that uneasy marriage. The children of La Malinche inherited the whole land. You can see the same thing every year at the start of November, when the whole country fills with marigolds. Families build altars in their homes, stacked with photographs, with food, with candles, and the bright orange flowers whose scent is said to guide the dead back home for one night. They sit in the cemeteries until dawn. They speak to the people they have lost as if they are simply away on a journey. The Catholic Church set those dates, All Saints, All Souls. But the conviction underneath them that the dead are not gone, only elsewhere, and that the door between the two worlds swings open once a year, is far older than any cathedral. It is the same instinct that built the Templo Mayor at the meeting point of the living and the underworld. The conquest did not erase the old world. It dressed it in new clothes. And the marigolds piled on the graves are the same orange as the butterflies that arrive in those same mountains every year with the dead. 3 centuries pass. Spain's empire crumbles. Mexico wins its independence in 1821, then spends decades tearing itself apart between liberals and conservatives, losing half of all its territory to the United States and drowning in foreign debt. And out of that long chaos comes the strangest empire of the 3. In the 1860s, Mexico stops paying its foreign creditors. France seizes on it as a pretext and invades. And the French emperor, together with a circle of Mexican conservatives who want a king, offers the throne of Mexico to a 31-year-old Austrian archduke, a younger brother of the Emperor of Austria, named Maximilian of Habsburg. He has never once set foot in the country. He accepts. There is a quiet symmetry his court would not have noticed. His own family already owns a piece of Mexico, the feathered crown of Moctezuma, carried across the ocean 3 centuries before, sitting in a case back home in Vienna. The Quetzal feathers of the First Empire's emperor went east to the Habsburgs. Now a Habsburg is coming west to wear the crown. In 1864, Maximilian and his wife Carlotta arrive and are crowned in the Metropolitan Cathedral, the cathedral built from the stones of the Templo Mayor. The prince of the Second Foreign Empire is consecrated, without ever quite realizing it, on the rubble of the first. For their residence, the imperial couple choose a castle on a wooded hill at the edge of the city. Chapultepec, the very same hill the Aztec emperors had kept as their private retreat 300 years before. It becomes the only castle in all of the Americas ever actually lived in by a reigning monarch. After the empire falls, that same castle will become the home of Mexico's presidents for the better part of a century, and then a national museum, an Aztec hilltop retreat that served in turn every power that ever ruled the valley. And to connect his castle to the heart of the old city, Maximilian orders a grand avenue cut dead straight across the capital. He names it for his empress. Today we call it the Paseo de la Reforma, and it is still the great central spine of Mexico City. Here is the contradiction that destroyed him. Maximilian was a romantic and, to the dismay of the men who imported him, a liberal. He upheld the breakup of the great estates. He limited child labor. He kept religious tolerance. He had the eagle and the serpent and the cactus, the ancient Mexica emblem, painted onto the doors of his imperial carriage. A Habsburg coach carrying the sign an exiled tribe had once seen on a swamp. He wore Mexican clothes, rode in the Mexican countryside, and convinced himself that the people loved him. But the conservatives who had brought him felt betrayed by his reforms, and the liberals he imitated would never accept a foreign prince installed by a foreign army. He was, as one account of him put it, too liberal for the conservatives and too conservative for the liberals. He sat on a throne with no ground beneath it at all. And then the ground gave way. The American Civil War ended, and the United States began pressing France to leave. France, facing new dangers of its own in Europe, withdrew its army. Maximilian's empire was suddenly a single prince and a handful of loyal men, with no power left behind them. He could have fled. He refused to abandon the people who had stayed with him. In 1867, the Republican army cornered him in the city of Querétaro, and after a long siege, he was taken alive. The man who now held his fate was the president the French had driven out of the capital and who had never once stopped calling himself president, Benito Juárez. The Zapotec shepherd's son, the boy who had spoken no Spanish until the age of 12, now held the life of a Habsburg emperor in his hands. Kings and writers across Europe wrote to him, begging for mercy. Juárez refused. A foreign power had imposed a monarch on Mexican soil, and Mexico, he decided, had to make it unmistakable once and for all that it never would again. Querétaro, called the Hill of the Bells, Maximilian and two of his generals were led out before a firing squad. He gave each of his executioners a gold coin and asked them not to shoot him in the face so that his mother might still recognize him. He spoke to them in Spanish. He said that he forgave everyone and asked everyone to forgive him and wished the country well. Then, the Third Empire was over, ended by a man whose own ancestors had leveled the summit of Monte Alban long before any European knew the valley existed. The Republic did not stay quiet for long. In 1910, after decades under a single strongman, Mexico erupted into revolution. 10 years of civil war that killed something on the order of 1 in every 15 people in the country. In the south, a farmer named Emiliano Zapata raised an army of indigenous villages behind 3 words: land and liberty. They had watched the great estates swallow the communal fields their ancestors had worked since before the conquest, and they wanted the ground itself returned. Zapata was lured into an ambush and shot dead in 1919, but the revolution he fought for rewrote the nation and placed the oldest question in the valley, the question of who owns the land, at the very center of the modern state. The republic that survived all of this grew, in time, into something none of the 3 empires could have pictured. Mexico today is a nation of around 130 million people, the largest Spanish-speaking country on Earth. And its capital, spread now across the entire floor of the old lake basin, has become one of the largest cities on the planet. More than 20 million people living and working where, 600 years ago, there was nothing but open water. And the modern nation did something none of the empires ever did. It turned around and claimed the bottom of the stack as its own. After the revolution, the government put its painters to work on the walls of its own ministries, and Diego Rivera covered them with the indigenous past. The great market of Tlatelolco in full color, the lake city in its glory, the conquest rendered as an open wound. His wife, Frida Kahlo, painted her own divided body as the meeting place of two bloodlines. For the first time, the country chose Tenochtitlan as an ancestor to be proud of, rather than a defeat to forget. You can taste the same continuity at any table in Mexico. The empire that has truly outlasted all the others here is an agricultural one. Corn, beans, squash, chilies, tomatoes, chocolate. Foods first bred in these valleys thousands of years ago are now carried to every kitchen on the planet. The Mexica grew their corn on rafts floating in the lake. The country still lives on it. Which raises a strange question. Why is that city sinking? Not slowly, not by inches over a lifetime, but by as much as 20 inches in a single year, in places fast enough now to measure from space. The answer is the lake. The Spanish drained Lake Texcoco away, but they could not remove what lay underneath it, a deep bed of soft, waterlogged clay, the silt of thousands of years, holding water like a saturated sponge. The modern city of 20 million is thirsty, and around 60% of its drinking water is pumped straight up out of the aquifer beneath its own streets. As the water is drawn out, the clay collapses and packs tighter, and the ground above it falls. Pump more, sink more. Pull the water out of the old lake bed, and the lake bed remembers and gives way. You can read the sinking on the city's own monuments. The Angel of Independence, the Golden Column standing on the Paseo de la Reforma, the Avenue Maximilian cut, once stood level with the street. So much ground has dropped away around it that workers have had to add step after step to its base just to reach it. It now sits at the top of more than a dozen stairs that did not exist when it was first built. Across the city, colonial churches lean, pavements ripple, water mains snap underground. The floor of the great central square is not quite flat. In some districts, the ground has fallen by 30 feet over the last century, and engineers expect parts of the basin to keep compacting for another 150 years. In 2025, a powerful new radar satellite began mapping that descent from orbit, watching the old lake bed give way centimeter by centimeter beneath the third great city to stand on it. And the city had already been warned, in the cruelest way possible, of exactly what it is built on. In 1985, an earthquake far out on the Pacific coast rolled inland into the soft lake bed clay and was amplified by it, the loose, saturated ground shaking like jelly, while the firm hills at the city's edge barely trembled. Thousands died in the center, where the old lake lies deepest. The ground does not forget what it used to be. In the days after that quake, before the army even arrived, it was ordinary people who dug through the rubble with their hands and pulled the living out. The same valley finding its feet again, the way it always has. None of this is to pretend the present is gentle. The headlines the world carries about Mexico are not invented. The cartels are real, and the toll of the long war against them runs into the hundreds of thousands of dead and disappeared. A wound the country lives with every day and has not closed. But no place is only its worst decade. The same nation that buries those dead also insists, loudly and without apology, that it answers to no power beyond its own borders, that, in the words of its current president, its sovereignty is not for sale. It is the same instinct that once put a European emperor in front of a firing squad. This valley has been ruled from the outside 3 times over, It has long since made up its mind never to be ruled from the outside again. And then, one night, the First Empire came back. It is just before midnight on the 21st of February, 1978. A crew from the City Electric Company is digging a trench at the corner of two streets behind the cathedral, in the heart of the old colonial centre, only a few feet below the modern pavement. Their blades strike stone. Not a wall, not a pipe, a carved disc more than 3 meters across, far too large and far too deliberate to be anything ordinary. When the archaeologists clear it, they find a goddess. It is the Mexica moon goddess, Coyolxauhqui, carved in the very moment of her dismemberment. And it is lying exactly where it had lain when the temple still stood, at the foot of the great staircase of the Templo Mayor. For 4.5 centuries, the heart of the Aztec Empire had been assumed lost, paved over, scattered, gone. It had been directly underfoot the entire time, a few feet beneath the busiest blocks of the modern capital. The excavation that followed pulled the temple back up into the daylight. 7 nested pyramids, one built inside the other, the stone record of 7 rulers, each raising a shell over the last. More than 7,000 buried offerings, masks, jade, the bones of eagles and jaguars, objects carried as tribute from every corner of the old empire. And the man who led that dig was an archaeologist named Eduardo Matos Moctezuma, who carried the same surname as the emperor seized in that exact precinct in 1519, returning 4.5 centuries later to lift his own city back out of the ground. And there they all were, at last, in a single line of sight. The excavated stones of the Templo Mayor, behind them, the cathedral built from those very stones, its towers leaning a degree off true as the lake bed keeps settling beneath them. Beside it, the National Palace, on the ground of the Emperor's old palace. And around all of it, the traffic, the vendors, the 20 million. Stand in that one spot, and you are not looking at history behind glass in a museum. You are looking at 3 empires at once, stacked in plain sight. The Aztec temple, the Spanish cathedral, the modern republic, exactly as the title promised, built on a single patch of soil, each one raised out of the wreckage of the one before, each one certain that it was the final word. None of them was. The ground simply kept the receipts. We have a name for this whole half of the world. We call it the New World, the lands that Europe stumbled onto, renamed, and counted as young. It is one of the great misnamings in all of history. The valley beneath Mexico City has held cities in an unbroken chain for the better part of 700 years, and the basin around it has been farmed and settled for far, far longer than that. There is very little here that is actually new. What there is instead is depth, layer beneath layer beneath layer, and the water at the very bottom of all of it, waiting. Because the lake is not entirely gone. In the canals of Xochimilco, on the southern edge of the city, a few of the old floating gardens still grow vegetables on the water, worked almost exactly as they were before Cortez ever landed. And in those last living channels survives a creature found nowhere else on Earth, the axolotl, a salamander that never grows up, keeping its feathery external gills and its strange permanent half smile for its entire life, and able to regrow a lost limb, a piece of its own heart, even part of its brain, without a scar. In the wild, It is now critically endangered, down to a scattering of individuals in the last clean water of the Aztec lake, the final native witness to a world that was very nearly drained out of existence. It holds on, in the one place the city never quite finished erasing. And in those last canals, biologists and the remaining Chinampa farmers have begun working side by side, cleaning the water, fencing off refuges, breeding the salamander back a little from the very edge of extinction. It is a small, stubborn refusal to let the final living piece of the Aztec lake slip away. And there is a kind of symmetry in who governs this sinking lake city now. For the first time in its long history, the country is led by a woman, and not only a politician, but a climate scientist, an energy engineer who spent her career studying exactly the kind of resource pressure that is dragging the ground down. The valley that was first settled by people reading a sign in the flight of an eagle is now run, in part, by people reading the slow descent of the land in radar beamed down from a satellite. Different instruments, the same valley. And the same question it has always asked. How do you live on ground that was never meant to hold this much weight? The eagle is still on the flag. It has outlasted the empire that first saw it on the cactus, the empire that tried to erase it, and the empire that stitched it onto the door of a Habsburg coach. The dead still come home every November along a road of marigolds. The temple is back up in the light, and underneath all of it, patient as ever, the old lake is rising again to meet the city that thought it had finally won. Not to destroy it exactly, but to remind it of something the Mexica understood the day they drove the first stake into the mud. Nothing built on this ground was ever the last thing. The valley is only lending you the space, and sooner or later, here, everything goes back to water. So the next time you stand in the middle of some great and certain city, look down. There is almost always another one beneath it. Thank you for traveling with us, and until the next journey, wherever on earth it takes us.